but it's good to basically know how the immune system works. In emergency medicine, probably the number one thing to remember about the immune system is not just the way it kills viruses and bacteria, but by the way it can accidentally attack your own tissues. Because there's a lot of diseases that are actually caused by the immune system attacking yourself. It gets confused because of a lot of factors. Some are genetic, some are environmental. But if the immune system, for any reason, loses the ability to recognize your own body as belonging to you, your immune system can start treating it like a foreign invader and can attack your own tissues. This is the cause of type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder. They didn't know this until the 1980s. But come to find out that people that have type 1 diabetes, they actually have a normal pancreas in utero, and then at some time in the early life of the patient, the immune system, for some reason, and they don't totally understand it, but the immune system loses the ability to recognize the insulin secreting beta cells in the pancreas called islet of Langerhans, and the immune system attacks them and kills them. So type 1 diabetes is not, you're not usually born with it. It develops because your immune system attacks your pancreas and kills those cells early in life. And then when you start to need the insulin, it's not available because your immune system killed it. Type 2 diabetes is not the same process, but there probably is some interaction with the immune system, but not as severe as in type 1 diabetes. So when we get into other things like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, there's a lot of autoimmune diseases that are caused by your immune system attacking yourself. Your body has several lines of defenses against invaders. You have cellular immunity, where these immune system things are in the interstitial space and just kind of hang out in the tissues. You have humoral immunity. Humoral means inside the bloodstream. Humoral immunity is where these cells circulate in the blood. You have both types. If you get a foreign invader, it can be a virus or a bacteria. Bacteria is a little bit easier to understand. Viruses are a lot more complicated and smaller and have to do with the way the DNA works. But we'll just take bacteria first because they're simpler. If a bacteria comes into the body, it has on its surface chemical sequences that we call antigens, and this just basically, it's a sequence of molecules that the body recognizes as not belonging to you. It sees it as an invader because it doesn't recognize. It's like if you try to walk into one of those fancy bars and you have to show your ID to get in. This guy doesn't have the right ID, right? So the body says that he can't come in. So if he comes in anyway, the body recognizes these as not belonging, so it activates a system. The main cell that we're going to talk about that's involved in kind of controlling this is called the macrophage. A macrophage is a type of immune cell, looks kind of like an amoeba, and this guy can change shape, and he can actually wander all around. He can go in between your cells. He can actually go into the bloodstream if he needs to. He moves around kind of like an amoeba does. And he has two important functions. One is he can recognize the antigens on the bacteria or virus that says it doesn't belong. And then it's up to him to do one of several things. He can actually try to gobble it up, but besides gobbling it up, when he does gobble it up, he saves these antigens and he starts showing different parts of the immune system who's invading. So he will actually express these antigens and start triggering an immune response by taking these antigens and saying, hey, look, this guy doesn't belong, look, this guy doesn't belong. So one of them is he expresses it to something called a helper T lymphocyte or helper T cell. And he shows these antigens to this guy and says, this guy doesn't belong, we need you guys to start working on this problem. So the helper T cell will differentiate and start controlling other functions. One is he will take that antigen and form a memory T cell. The memory T cell, it's his job just to hang out and remember what this thing looked like in case they come back later. Kind of like it's like a defense thing. Says, you remember this because this guy might come back later and cause trouble. So your main job is just to remember who this guy is. Okay? And then they recruit cytotoxic T cells called killer T cells. And these guys actually attack the bad guy and start killing him. They can release superoxides and different kinds of chemicals and to actually kill the bacteria or virus. A third function is called suppressor T cells. And what these guys do is they try to prevent the system from overreacting, and they provide feedback to try to keep the reaction from getting out of control. It actually has a negative feedback if it gets too activated. We don't want all these guys attacking your own tissues. So there is a system for feedback to where it says, okay, kill the bad guys, but don't get carried away and start killing the good guys. So let's just start the normal thing right here. This is normal virus bacteria. Now, another thing besides the T cells is it stimulates B cells or antibodies. An antibody is a cool thing. It's almost always shaped like a Y. And if you look under an electron microscope, you can see these guys, and they look like little Ys. And they have a variable part and a constant part. The constant part is down here. And up here, called variable. And you'll also see things called heavy chains and light chains. That just has to do with the molecule that makes up these segments. What's important, though, is the variable part here, because even though most antibodies are shaped like a Y, the part that actually recognizes the invader is on the tip of the two Y parts. So let's say you have a bacteria here, and he has surface antigens here. And in order for this bacteria to do its thing, it has to be able to do certain chemical reactions and interact with other cells. And once the macrophage will express the antigen to the beta cells. And if it's a first-time exposure, there may not be the correct number. There may not be enough of these guys around. But usually, by the time the second exposure comes, these have been cloned, so the body has a lot of these that are specific to the antigen of the foreign invader. So once one of these guys recognizes the antigen, it will actually start multiplying and make clones. It's genetically identical. So what happens is, as soon as one of these guys recognizes the specific antigen, and it's the shape of a molecule, in other words, when the tip of this fits on this, that's the one that gets stimulated, and it'll start making copies of itself. It'll start reproducing. Not all the other ones, just the one that recognizes this antigen. So the body starts making clones of the antibody that recognizes the antigen and makes millions of these guys. And now every one of them will fit the receptor. So you have a whole bunch of these guys. What they will do is they will come and they will plug in to the site and inactivate it, and what this also does is this also gives feedback. This process also gives feedback to these guys, and they see the antigen-antibody complex, and that also stimulates more of these guys. It kind of says, okay, here we are. It's got these little guys attached to it, so this is a bad guy. So then the other cells can come in and start gobbling it up. Yeah?
What's the difference between
one's job is to make more of these guys, and the other guy's job is to make more of these guys. Yeah. Now, when you give somebody like a vaccine, what happens is, if you give somebody a vaccine, you're taking a piece of a bacteria or a piece of a virus, and you're killing the part that's going to be harmful, but you're saving the part that has the antigen that the body recognizes. So you inject into somebody a vaccine. The vaccine will have a dead part of the bacteria or virus, but the part that has the antigen. So you're teaching the body to recognize the antigen, and the body reproduces these memory cells. And the next time you come in contact with that invader, then your immunity is ready for it, because the vaccine got your immune system all ready to go for it. It recognizes the guys. Now, there are different types of antibodies. We won't go a lot into them. You see names, let me find the slide. There's IgA, IgG, IgE. We will talk a little bit about IgE antibodies. You have a lot of different kinds of antibodies, and they specialize in different things. You have a type of antibody called the IgE antibody. People that have exaggerated allergic reactions tend to have a high titer or blood level of IgE antibodies. And these guys can actually overreact. And what happens is, in people who are prone to allergic reactions, like people that can eat a peanut and die or get a bee sting and die, in your tissue, here's a blood vessel, in your tissue you have these things called mast cells. And a mast cell is full of all kinds of potential nasties. It's got things like histamine, serotonin, slow-reacting substance of anaphylaxis, bradykinin, leukotrienes, and all these little chemicals. It's like a bag full of chemicals. Now, the body can use these chemicals to kill bacteria, but people that have a high titer of IgE antibodies, sometimes when the IgE antibodies attaches to the invader, like if you have an allergy to peanuts or an allergy to bee stings, what happens is the antigen-antibody reaction gets carried away, and it goes and starts busting open mast cells, too many mast cells. And so all of these chemicals start pouring out of the mast cells, and it causes the mast cell to degranulate. That just means break apart and bust open. And if you have all these little bags full of toxic chemicals that the body selectively uses to kill bacteria, and then all of a sudden they all start bursting, it can cause havoc. So what happens is it releases all these nasty chemicals like histamine. Now, histamine can be used by the body for different things. It's a vasodilator, but if you suddenly release a lot of histamine, it causes all the blood vessels to dilate. You have something called slow-reacting substance of anaphylaxis, and this substance is a vasodilator, and it also, you have histamine, and these are also pro-inflammatory chemicals. They cause the inflammatory process to kind of become unglued, and the body over-responds, and you have a systemic inflammatory reaction. Now, some of these chemicals can also cause bronchoconstriction. You can start wheezing. It can actually close off your airway. It dilates too many blood vessels, so your blood pressure drops. It causes cell membranes to start leaking fluid. So histamine does that. Histamine will cause the blood vessel wall to start leaking. So now fluid can start pouring in and out where it shouldn't belong, and a tremendous amount of fluid can actually go into the skin, cause hives, cause edema. If you've ever seen somebody having a life-threatening allergic reaction, they can blow up like a grape. I mean, they can really, you see swelling, their face turns bright red. And this is a life-threatening thing. It can happen very quickly if you have somebody who's really sensitized to the antigen. If somebody is highly allergic to peanuts or bee stings or any specific antigen, they can actually die in 10 minutes if they come in contact with that substance. That's why it's important to be able to recognize anaphylactic shock and treat it effectively. You have medicines that work really well. Epinephrine is a very powerful hormone that will reverse most of the effects of these chemicals, but it has to be recognized and given promptly. Usually, if the reaction is just starting, the epinephrine can be given subcutaneously or intramuscularly. But if someone has a life-threatening anaphylaxis, sometimes you'll actually have to give the epinephrine IV slowly, because if you just inject it into the tissue, the perfusion of the tissue can be so poor because their blood pressure is so low, and because they have fluid where it shouldn't be, that medicine may not get absorbed and it may kill them. So sometimes in true anaphylaxis you have to do things quickly, and sometimes IV. When we were talking about genetics, a lot of diseases are purely genetic, and others are an interaction between the person's genes in the environment. And the environment, like we're talking about, can actually trigger a genetic predisposition for something because of the way the DNA works. Okay, we talked about immunology a little bit. Cancer, there's a big misconception about cancer, and I think I talked about this a little bit the other day. Cancer is not really a disease. And there won't really be a cure for cancer because cancer is like 1,000 different things. But we didn't understand that until people started looking into genetics and how cancer worked and what caused cancer. Cancer is usually a situation where a tissue starts over reproducing and the cell growth becomes uncontrolled. And whether the cancer is a malignant type or a benign type depends on what type of tissue is involved, how likely it is to over reproduce, and the type of cells that are involved. There are certain genetic diseases that are prevalent in certain populations because those populations don't intermix. Like Ashkenazi Jews from Central Europe have an extremely high percentage of Tay-Sachs disease, which is a genetic disorder. And because of cultural and religious reasons, the people in that culture almost never marry outside of their sect. So what happens is it's like marrying your cousin or marrying your sister. It's kind of like that. What happens is if you have a population and all these people are intermarrying in a small population, you get all kinds of genetic disorders and they get worse and worse and worse and worse. So same thing happens with dogs. If you go to dog shows and find a beautiful purebred dog that wins the dog show and find out how often that dog has cardiomyopathy, hip dysplasia, as people try to purify things, they get sicker and sicker and sicker, and eventually they're going to have these horrible mutants that have very painful lives. Okay, endocrine disorders. The 16 lectures that y'all had, one of them was very well done. He talked about the 10 endocrine things. I think he started with the pineal gland. Pineal gland in the brain, a little teeny thing in the brain. They used to think that it was the third eye when they first discovered it. But yeah, the pineal gland, and what does it make? Melatonin, right? Melatonin, it's a hormone that helps regulate awake and sleep cycles. It helps regulate seasonal cycles. It helps regulate like hibernation, like bears hibernate. So this hormone is important for circadian rhythms. The circadian rhythm is every animal species has a circadian rhythm. It tells the animal when to stay awake, when to sleep, when to breed, when to go to bed, when to build a cave. In humans, it has a lot to do with sleep cycles. Yeah, pituitary. Okay, pituitary. Pituitary gland actually hangs down from the base of the brain. If you remember when we were talking about the skull, and they took our skeleton, they didn't bring it back. Remember, I had the base of the skull, and I held up there, and I said this little indentation called the Cellular. It's an indentation into the sphenoid bone at the base of the brain. The pituitary gland sits right in that little indentation of the sphenoid bone called the Cellular Turkish saddle, and it sits there. And the pituitary gland is divided into the anterior and posterior. The main hormones you'll be responsible for in anterior is growth hormones. And in the posterior pituitary, there's two that you need to know. One's called ADH. One's called oxytocin. I don't think the guy's lecture talked about oxytocin. He did talk about ADH. Yeah. And ADH is also called vasopressin, which is a drug that is an ACLS. If you look at ACLS protocols in cardiac arrest, they say give epinephrine or vasopressin. Well, vasopressin is nothing more than antidiuretic hormone. It has effects very similar to epinephrine or adrenaline. It's a vasoconstrictor, mild stimulant of the heart. But it also causes the body to not get rid of water. It also causes the kidney to retain salt, to retain water. So it does have a lot of effects of retaining fluid. If you go into hypovolemic shock, Remember the guy I said you bled out 2 liters. Not only will it's epinephrine, norepinephrine, aldosterone, all these things are going, but if you look at the pituitary gland, it's secreting ADH because it has the same effect as epinephrine. It helps raise the blood pressure. It helps the kidney retain fluid. You don't want to get rid of any more fluid. So this is used in times of fluid regulation. This is how the body helps build back up fluid if you're dehydrated or if you bled. Oxytocin we'll learn a lot more about when we get to OBGYN. This is the main hormone that causes the uterus to contract in the gravid uterus when if someone is time to have their baby. The contractions of labor are started by cycles of oxytocin. And if you go to the hospital and you want to induce labor, they just give you an IV bag with this in it, and you're going to go into labor. They start that IV bag with oxytocin in it, you're going to go into labor. It causes phasic contractions of the uterus. It also causes milk letdown. So when the mother has the baby, her breasts start to produce milk because oxytocin tells her breast that the baby's being born, and it's time for the breast to start producing milk. That's why when the lady has the baby, the breast will start producing a lot more milk because oxytocin tells the milk to leave the ductwork and go into the breast. And so both of these are associated mainly with childbirth. It does other stuff too. We'll get into later. That's the main thing though. So now, growth. The anterior pituitary secretes growth hormone and ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Growth hormone helps regulate not only how tall you are, but how fast your tissues grow. Helps control metabolic rate, how fast your tissues divide, how fast your cells reproduce. And if you have a tumor, an adenoma of the growth or the anterior pituitary, you can have giantism, people that are like 8 feet tall. Okay, we talked about, we're not going to go much, we talked about this already, but the other hormone we talked about is the adrenal medulla and the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex, which is the outside part, has 3 layers. And one of the funniest things I ever heard in my physiology class was how they gave you a way to remember which hormone came from which layer. It's kind of funny. Okay, the outside layer of the adrenal cortex secretes aldosterone, which helps with salt regulation. The middle part of the adrenal cortex secretes cortisol, which helps regulate sugar and inflammation and all kinds of other stuff. The inside secretes androgens, which are sex hormones. Now we know that aldosterone causes the body to retain fluid. It inhibits the kidney's outflow of water and salt. It helps the kidney retain salt and water. Helps the kidney get rid of potassium. So sodium and water are pulled back into the body. Potassium is excreted. So it helps the body retain liquid. So you would expect a high level of aldosterone in somebody who had bled or needed to retain fluid. If you have somebody with high blood pressure, you don't want the effects of aldosterone because the aldosterone will make the blood pressure go too high. So there are drugs that are used for hypertension that block the effects of aldosterone. There are specific aldosterone inhibitors like spironolactone. Pancreas. We didn't talk about the pancreas at all. Okay, pancreas secretes a lot of hormones. It secretes both endocrine hormones and exocrine hormones. We will mainly talk about the endocrine hormones, which we're talking about endocrinology. And what is an endocrine hormone? What's endocrinology? You have 2 types of glands. If a gland secretes a substance into a hollow organ like your intestines or something like that, or if it secretes the substance outside the body like sweat, then it's called an exocrine because the substance does not go into the bloodstream. It goes outside the body. Because if you secrete something into the GI tract, that's not really inside the body. Your GI tract is actually outside the body if you think about it. The GI tract is a tube, a hollow tube that goes from your mouth to your anus that's actually not in your body. It's actually outside your body. That's why there's bacteria in your GI tract, but those bacteria really aren't inside the body. if you secrete sweat, it goes from the skin out into the atmosphere. It's not really inside the body. So an exocrine gland secretes something outside the body. An endocrine gland secretes a hormone directly into the bloodstream. So like epinephrine or norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla, that's endocrine, it goes in the bloodstream. Growth hormone goes from the pituitary gland into the bloodstream, that's endocrine gland. So the pancreas, the endocrine of the pancreas are, you have alpha cells, you have beta cells. There's other types of cells too, but these are the ones we can come out. The alpha cells secrete something called glucagon. The beta cells secrete something called insulin. These both are from the pancreas. One of these causes your blood sugar to go up, one causes your blood sugar to go down. So this is how your body regulates your blood sugar and the availability of carbohydrates to the cell. Your cell has to have a constant supply of glucose. Like we talked about today, glucose is really the main substance the body uses for energy. So your cells need a constant supply of glucose available. But glucose does not go into the cell on its own. The molecule does not go through the cell membrane very well. It has to have a carrier. And so insulin activates, let's say here's the carrier that lets sugar go inside the cell. Insulin comes and activates that receptor to allow sugar inside the cell. Without that, the sugar will not go inside the cell, and the cell will die. The cell has to have sugar to metabolize in the mitochondria, and if it doesn't have that, it can't produce ATP. And if it can't produce ATP, the cell will die. So if sugar cannot get inside the cell will die. So it needs to get in. So now that it's in, the cell can metabolize it. There's very fine feedback loops. Everybody knows about feedback loops between insulin and blood sugar. As your blood sugar starts to go back low, it has an inhibitory effect to reduce the insulin, so then the insulin is secreted less. The blood sugar is high, stimulates the insulin to be released, and it kind of is imbalanced. Now, if anything causes your blood sugar to go too low, then glucagon is activated, and glucagon goes to the liver, tells the liver to secrete glycogen. Glycogen is a form of carbohydrate stored in the liver that can be converted into glucose. So glucagon tells the liver to secrete glycogen. Glycogen is converted into glucose, and then that makes the blood sugar go back up. So if the blood sugar is too high or too low, there's a way that the body can bring it back into balance. Paramedics can actually give glucagon, and I think that's probably one of the drugs on your list. Glucagon can raise the blood sugar in an emergency. What's normally done, though, is you normally just inject glucose right into the bloodstream. You get something called P50, which is 50% glucose that raises the blood sugar immediately. Now, the pancreas also secretes exocrine hormones. You have, in your body, you have carbohydrates, right? You have protein, you have fats. The pancreas secretes something to help digest all three of these. You have amylase, lipase, and trypsin. Each of these is designed to help break down a certain type of food product for your body to utilize. These come out of the pancreas, but they're not secreted into the bloodstream, they're secreted into the small intestine and into the duodenum or duodenum. Now if you look at the pancreas is here, the pancreas has a central duct. Pancreas has a duct that goes right in the middle of it. So these exocrine hormones are secreted into the duct. The duct goes right down and goes into the small intestine. The food, having just come from the stomach, is starting to come through the small intestine. The pancreas secretes these three chemicals into the small intestine and helps start breaking down the food so it can be absorbed from the small intestine. Carbohydrates are broken apart by amylase. One of the things that breaks them apart is amylase. Fats are emulsified and help to be broken down by lipase. And protein helps to be broken down into its amino acids with trypsin. You will see something called heterozygote and homozygote. This has to do with genetic diseases, or genes in general, even if it's not a genetic disease. When we talk about specific genetic problems that cause disease, you will see it says, well, this person is heterozygote for this mutation, or this person is homozygote for this mutation. What that means is, what homo or heterozygote means is, heterozygote means that one parent has one gene, the other parent has the other gene. Some diseases occur in heterozygotes, and some diseases only occur in homozygotes, and that is determined by whether it's a dominant or recessive gene. I know this is complicated, right? Yeah. On either side of your trachea, right about here, you have thyroid gland. Kind of shaped like a butterfly. It's small in the middle and fat on the outside. Thyroid. Up in your brain, hypothalamus secretes something that helps regulate thyroid gland called TSH. Stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. As the TSH goes up, that makes your thyroid get stimulated, and your thyroid shoots out several hormones. One is called triiodothyronine. These all have abbreviations, so don't panic. Triiodothyronine is also called T3, and thyroxine is also called T4. So in medicine, you will never hear somebody say his triiodothyronine. They'll call it T3, and they normally won't say thyroxine. They'll say T4. So they'll say test is T3 or T4. And there are different forms of T3 and T4, whether they're bound to plasma proteins or not. One's called free, one's called conjugated. So you'll hear them say do a free T3. We're not going to get into why that's different, but T3 and T4 are the two main thyroid hormones. They have a feedback to the brain that secretes thyroid stimulating hormone that tells the thyroid to put out more T3 or T4 depending on your basal metabolic rate and how fast your body is metabolizing things. Thyroid hormones help control the rate of metabolism. In other words, how fast your thermos is burning. Under the effects of these hormones, the cell metabolism goes up. The rate of chemical processes goes up. It increases your metabolic rate. You always hear these diet pills say it increases your metabolic rate, makes you lose weight better. So these hormones are really the things that regulate your metabolic rate. If you have thyroid abnormalities, it can really affect your metabolic rate. There are disorders of thyroid. There's hypothyroidism, where your body does not make enough thyroid hormone. There's hyperthyroidism, where your body makes too much thyroid hormone. If someone is hypothyroid, they would have a tendency to lack energy, maybe be overweight, maybe have slow metabolism. If someone has hyperthyroid, they might be thin, they would tend to have tachycardia, sweat a lot. They have something called exophthalmos, to where their eyes can actually bulge out if they have too much thyroid hormone. If you Google images exophthalmos, you'll see someone who's hypothyroid and have their eyes actually bug out. Now, what you need to understand the relationship between TSH and T3 and T4. They are inversely proportional to each other, because TSH is a stimulating hormone. If you are hypothyroid, your TSH will be high. If you're hypothyroid, okay, I think I said it backwards. If you don't have enough T3 and T4, your TSH will actually be high. So hypothyroid. So hypothyroid means you don't make enough T3 and T4. So your TSH is elevated. Why? Because this is your brain trying to get your thyroid to put out hormones. It's got a feedback. It can sense how much of these chemicals are in the bloodstream. if there's not enough T3 and T4 in the bloodstream, the brain says, I want to make more. So the brain starts cranking out more and more and more TSH. So as your TSH goes up and up and up, that means your thyroid function is actually too low. It's opposite of what it seems. And a lot of people, they go, well, if I'm hypothyroid, why do I have too much TSH? Because that's the stimulator that's trying to get the thyroid to work more. And vice versa. If you're hyperthyroid, your TSH is going to be low because what's happening is the high levels of T3 and T4 are having an inhibitory feedback loop and causing the brain to secrete less TSH. Remember, they're opposite to what you would think. It's all we'll talk about thyroid. When we get into medical emergencies, we'll talk a little bit more about thyroid emergencies. Okay, hematological disorders and cardiovascular disorders. These are the two most complex and the two most interesting, in my opinion, because they're so close. We have to talk about these at the same time. Cholesterol is just the tip of the iceberg. Cholesterol is not the cause of, I would say cholesterol is probably the cause of less than half of cardiac problems, or less than half of coronary artery disease. Traditionally, cardiologists have just basically pretended like it was just a cholesterol problem because that's all they studied. Hematology was studied by hematologists, and they went into oncology and cancer therapy. So if you really wanted a good workup on blood clotting, you didn't go to the cardiologist, you went to the hematologist who basically worked in cancer treatment. Because if you go get clotting, today if you wanted to go get a clotting workup, you would probably have to go to a cancer doctor because that's where the hematologists live. And even today, most of the hematologists are associated with cancer treatment. But that's going to change in the next 10 years because of what we discovered doing research into what causes heart disease. Here's kind of, I don't think I want to start this before lunch because this gets kind of into it. We'll start on this and then during lunch I'll try to grade the test. Here's an artery. Now this artery can be anywhere in the body, but since heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States, and this is probably the core of this course, the most important thing to understand is basically cardiovascular disorders, and probably the #1 big one to where you can save a life. If you do something right, you can save a life. If you don't do it, the person will die. That's 80% of the time that's going to be either cardiology or endocrine abnormalities. Whereas you can do something specifically and save a life, where if you don't do it right, they're going to die. Most of it's cardiology. Okay. Let's say this artery's in the heart. This is a coronary artery. Here's the heart. Here's the aorta. Right above the aortic valve, you have the coronary arteries that go down and feed the heart muscle. A review: when on the left side, on the left, I'll draw you. Okay, here's the aortic valve, and the left ventricle's down here. Just above the aortic valve, you have something called the orifice of the coronary artery. This little white area is called the sinus of Valsalva. On the left side, you normally have a small segment called the left main coronary artery. It's not usually very long. There's a lot of variability in this. Some people's will be real short, some people's will be longer. Some people actually don't even have one. Some people, the left anterior descending and the circumflex will come off as separate vessels, so there's a lot of variability. But I'm going to give you the typical presentation. The left main only goes for about ½ inch, even if not that. And then it divides. Coming down the front of the heart, you have the left anterior descending. Left anterior descending. Comes down the front of the heart. Then this goes over here. It's called the circumflex. The circumflex goes along the lateral side of the left ventricle, and I don't know if you can see this. So this little top drawing up here, that's basically the drawing we're doing. The circumflex goes around here to the left, feeds the left lateral wall, and then comes around back to the back part of the heart. The left anterior descending feeds most of the front part of the heart and a large amount of the septum, the muscle wall between the left and right ventricle, called the septum. On the right side, the right coronary artery comes off, feeds most of the bottom of the heart because there's something called the posterior descending artery. If you follow the right coronary artery around, it goes back around and then runs down the back of the heart all the way to the bottom, and that's called the posterior descending artery, and it's the end of the right coronary artery. The top of the right coronary artery is shaped like a C. If you look at it on a cardiac cath, it looks just like a C because it comes out and goes back around the back side of the heart and then runs down the back of the heart. That's called the right coronary artery. When we get to cardiology, you will need to know the names of these vessels because it affects the way the EKG looks. It affects where the heart attack is. If you see a specific type of heart attack on the EKG, you'll know with about an 80% likelihood which artery is blocked and where you see the heart attack on the cardiogram. So you will need to know these terms. I probably won't test you on these terms right now, but when you get to cardiology, you'll have to know them. But just to know that the left main, left circumflex, left anterior descending, right coronary artery. Now, if you really want to learn this, cool. About how many? There's 23 people in this class. About 4 of you in this class have another artery that goes right between these. That's called the ramus intermedius, or just called ramus. Stresses on them being backwards. Okay, now let's talk about what causes artery disease. And this will help you understand how cholesterol works and how cholesterol is not the only thing that affects heart disease. Let's take the LAD, the artery we just talked about, and now we're going to blow up a part of that artery. Remember, an artery has 3 layers. The outside layer is real hard and fibrous, called adventitia. The middle layer is real thick. It's made of smooth muscle. It's called media. The inside layer, intima. And you'll see the word tunica. Tunica just means coat. It's a word that goes way back to a long time ago. You know what a tunic is? A tunic? In Latin, tunica just means coat. So when they started describing these tissues, they call them the tunica intima, the tunica media, and the tunica adventitia. Just means the coat that covers. It has no other meaning.
You said the adventitia is
real hard and not hard. It's very tough, thin but tough. You can see right through it. It's actually very. Picture the outside covering to a sausage. If you look at a real sausage, they use the intestines of an animal to stuff the sausage into, and it's also artificial, but it's very tough. If you take the meat out of the sausage, the skin that's left is hard to pull. That's what the adventitia is like. It's thin, it's clear, you can actually see through it, but it's actually the strongest part of the artery. The media is the thickest part. It's smooth muscle. The smooth muscle fibers actually wrap around one way, wrap around the other way. They actually have 3 different directions that they can wrap. And that lets the artery constrict or dilate. So arteries can constrict and dilate according to a lot of different things. Remember, epinephrine constricts them, norepinephrine constricts them. Nitric oxide dilates them. Nitroglycerin dilates them. These arteries respond to a lot of different drugs and chemicals. Now, what causes artery disease is complicated, but here's the basic process. We're gonna take a piece of this artery right here and blow it up in a microscope. Squamous epithelial cells. The inside lining of the artery is Squamous epithelium is very thin. We'll just call this the endothelium. Endothelium is the actual inside lining of the artery. This is where it all happens.
Separate from the intima?
In the endothelial layer is the inside layer of the intima. Yeah, so you have more cells here. The intima is more than one cell layer thick. But we're going to talk about just the very inside lining right now. If you notice that in between each of these cells is a little gap. And we'll just call this a pore, but it's just a gap. That gap is around 18 to 20 nanometers, which is real small. Small. Or not a nanometer, billionth of a centimeter. No, billionth of a meter probably.
Billion?
A billionth of a meter, I think, is a nanometer, I think. I mean, small, little. Yeah. You couldn't see it without a microscope. It takes a strong microscope to see a nanometer. Okay. Once you get smaller than that, you're talking about angstroms, which are like the size of atoms and molecules. This is very small pore, but your body carries lipids in packages called lipoproteins. And you have different kinds of lipoproteins. You have high-density lipoproteins called HDL, which that's what HDL stands for, high-density lipoproteins. So you have HDL cholesterol. Now, cholesterol is actually carried inside of lipoproteins. HDL is actually the carrier of the cholesterol. The carrier is kind of like something inside of a bucket. The HDL is a carrier of cholesterol. And you have low-density lipoproteins, LDL, and they carry cholesterol in their little packets too. HDL is what they call good cholesterol. The reason they call HDL good cholesterol is because the higher your HDL, the less likely you are to have coronary disease, at least at the type we're going to talk about first. LDL is also called bad cholesterol because the higher your LDL, the more likely you are to have this type of disease that we're going to talk about. Now, not only is LDL the bad cholesterol, there are different kinds of LDL. The smaller LDL, the smaller the worse. Okay, so small is bad, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Small is bad. So LDL comes in different packet sizes. The smallest packets are the most dangerous. Here's why. And this is the basic thing that causes the typical coronary artery disease. But as you'll see in a minute, it's not just due to cholesterol. If you have a lot of small, dense LDL, and that a lot of that's genetic, it's a genetic pattern, the particles are small. They can actually fit in between the pores, between the endothelial cells. As long as the cholesterol stays in the bloodstream, the body's happy with it, because that's where it belongs. You have to have cholesterol in order to live. If your cholesterol is too low, you die because all your nerves and brain are mainly of cholesterol. If you look at the color of the brain, it's kind of a whitish yellow color. That's because that's the color of fat, because the brain is mainly made of cholesterol and other lipids. And nervous tissue is also yellow because it's also made of lipids too. Your nerves have a lot of cholesterol in them. But these particles are